Kia ora, welcome to Shared Lunch, brought to you by Sharesies with BusinessDesk. My name's Patrick Smelly, I'm the founding editor at BusinessDesk, and today on Shared Lunch we are joined by former Climate Change Minister and Green Party co-leader James Shaw as he wraps up his last days at Parliament. We'll discuss climate change policy and politics, the issues facing both business and investors. But before we get started, here's some important information that you must bear in mind.
Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording.
Thanks for coming in, James. I wanted to talk rather for this audience, which is an investing audience and one which needs to think about what the future is going to look like and how wealth is going to be created and so on, to really focus on current development of climate change policy in New Zealand and globally. Where are we now? Where do you think we're heading? And what do we need to do to get to the place where we need to be? I know that's three short questions with a very long answer.
Well, actually, so Rod Carr, the chair of the Commission, I think articulates this better than I ever could, where he says the transition is going to happen. The choice for us is whether we do it late and more expensively or earlier and cheaper. Right, that's really what it comes down to, and so the kind of Commission's advice is sort of framed really within those terms. If you extrapolate that out to the kind of planetary scale, I'd say we're on the late, expensive track globally, but that doesn't mean that New Zealand needs to be trapped in the same, kind of lane as everybody else.
Yeah, what does that mean? Late and expensive, and because there's a part of me that wonders whether if we're late and it's going to be expensive, we might fail.
Oh, well, I'll come to the failure bit. Like, the definition of failure is important here. But I'll give you an example, right? So if you assume that one of the things that has to happen is the complete phase out of fossil fuels, if you leave that late, it is likely to be a more disorderly exit and therefore more expensive, right? And you'll have far greater stranded asset costs associated with that. If you start early and try and have a smooth transition, you'll be able to lower that cost and take more of a kind of a return on investment without having to write assets off.
Yeah. So, just help me to unpick this a bit, because we've had the draft advice from the Climate Change Commission, both on the 2036 to 40 emissions budget and on our progress towards net zero by 2050. Those reports seem to me to say two things which may not mean the same thing, but certainly seem contradictory to me. On one hand, it says, set aside methane, we will actually get to our 2050 net zero target probably early. But then it also says if we don't take more action in New Zealand to reduce emissions, we are going to have a very expensive time of it in that last 10 years particularly.
Yeah, and I don't think that those things are necessarily contradictory. The net zero for long-lived gases, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, so they think that we can get to that slightly earlier, partially because the technology curve is, Moore's law applies. Yeah, the technology curve exists, and that's helping. Secondarily, we're planting a lot more trees than we thought that we were going to, because there was a bounce when the carbon price went really high and everyone kind of piled in and planted a ton of trees, and that'll have a long-run effect. The problem with that is that forests aren't ultimately permanent, and there is a harvest cycle for our plantation forests, and so whilst you get to net zero, things get a little bit harder to stay there, but the kind of economic, so that's kind of the big drivers. The economic kind of shift, though, is a more rapid technology adoption probably lowers overall economic impact than kind of a later, when you're kind of the last cab off the rank, and so. I'll give you an example. Electrification. If there was the report from Rewiring Aotearoa that was out maybe 2 weeks ago, that they worked out that the installed cost of solar plus battery and the replacement of all of the fossil fuel devices in your home, starting with your car, because that's the big one. But, gas hot water, gas central heating, gas hobs, whatever you've got that runs on fossil fuels, you replace those with electric devices, electric car, electric hob, electric, so on and so forth, installed solar plus battery. That lowers the household cost by anywhere from something like $1,600 to $5,000, depending on the household.
Per annum?
Per annum, per household, because most of the cost of your electricity bill is in the lines and the transmission charges, right? So what they're saying is that if you take power which falls out of the sky for free, after the capital cost of installation, that competes admirably with supplied energy, right?
So when you say after the cost of installation,
no,
what's the payback time?
You can amortize that a number of different ways, right? So if you again, another example, there are solar installers like say Lightforce, who would just be like, you want the kit, we'll come and do the kit, and that can be, I don't know, $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the size and scale of what it is that you install. But that's that's a capital outlay straight up front. And loads of people, that's fine. And actually most banks will now give you a 0 interest loan, which in these particular times is having free money is pretty amazing. So you can do that. But then you've got other options, for example, like Solar Zero, who say actually for no upfront cost we'll put it in, but then we'll carry the cost out. In fact, I think, but with them it's highly variable, right? Like I think the longest term for them is 20 years if depending again on the size.
And you effectively pay them a tariff.
Yeah, exactly. So there are different ways of handling the kind of capex opex kind of swap in that. The overall point though is that the kind of impact of being able to switch households over to electric has a microeconomic effect. It also has a macroeconomic effect, because if you stop importing petroleum into the country, then our balance of payments deficit closes, right? Almost completely. In a sort of, that was pre-COVID numbers. It's all up the spout since COVID. But, before COVID,
I know what you're saying.
The amount of petrol that we imported was roughly equivalent to our entire balance of payments deficit. So you kind of leave that transition longer, then actually you're paying other countries for supplied energy in the form of petroleum that for longer, right? So you're kind of prolonging the outlay cost. And, given where we are located in the global supply chains, faster moving countries like, say, Australia, most ships go to Australia before they come to New Zealand, may end up just taking all of the EVs and all of the solar panels that people can provide,
Yep.
and then those
Well, I
ships
suppose
are
that's my
empty by the
question.
time
Why,
they
if it's so obvious that we should do it and commercially viable, why is it not happening at a great pace?
But it is starting to. And having said that, there are lots of barriers in place, right? So there's regulatory barriers. If to come back to the installed household solar in Australia, if you want to, but between the customer, the householder making a decision, I want solar, and the installation, there are 2 points of contact. In New Zealand, it's 12.
Right.
Who the hell is going to? Well,
This
I mean,
sounds
actually, a lot
like
of
something
people
you should
are.
have a word to David Seymour about.
I have had a word to David Seymour about it.
Nice.
Yeah. Because there are things that, actually some regulatory reform will both make it easier, and if you kind of apply the analogy to, an internet website, the more clicks you have to get to the point that you want to, you drop out. I mentioned a couple of solar installers recently. So they're really good at installing solar. But there's no one who's a one-stop shop which says, I'm going to electrify your whole household, right? I'll replace your car, I'll replace your gas hot water, I'll replace your gas hob, I'll replace your gas central heating, and I'll wire you up for solar and
is
and
that
battery.
business model emerging anywhere in the world at this stage?
Yeah, it's starting to. So in the United States, after the Inflation Reduction Act,
Yep.
There's been a considerable acceleration in electrification, and they've got a kind of a loan scheme there that helps with the kind of capital outlay, and people, the private sector is starting to kind of respond by offering those sort of packages, right? So I think that there are opportunities there. We have 2% of our households have solar and battery. In Australia, it's 30%. If we had 30% coverage of rooftop solar and battery, Huntly would have closed. Huntly. You could shut Huntly, right? And we would get to pretty much about 98% renewable, right? If we had the same rate of solarisation as Australia.
So that's electrification. What is the climate change draft advice telling us about the future of forestry planting?
It says a number of things, one of which is that you've got to keep planting trees, and for two reasons. One of which is that in order to stay below net zero, to get to net zero and then to stay below it, you have to keep planting as long as you're emitting, right? So as long as your gross emissions are still high, you need to continue planting new forests to offset them, which is part of the urgency in their advice. Is they're saying, if you don't want to convert every farm in the country away from food and into forestry, then you've got to bring your gross emissions down. You've actually got to stop putting pollution into the atmosphere in the first place. You've got to reduce demand for forest offsets, essentially. The other thing that they're saying is that whilst we need to, and the other thing is that they're pointing out that actually we need to get to negative emissions, right? Net zero is merely a stop in the way. Currently, we put 80 million tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere every year. We take 20 million tonnes out, so we're about 60 up. That should be reversed, right? Imagine what it would be like if we put 20 million tonnes of pollution into the atmosphere, but we took 60 out, and then you're at minus 40, or take 80 out, and then you're at minus 60. So that's kind of where we need to get to. In order to do that, you have to actually scale up sequestration from the atmosphere, pulling it out of the atmosphere, right? Because the longer it stays up there, the more it continues to heat the atmosphere. So you're going to need more forests. The other thing that they say, which some people think is contradictory, but I don't think is that we've got to get the forestry settings right in the ETS, which doesn't cover everything, but in the ETS. Because at the moment, with an unlimited amount of forestry allowed, anytime the ETS price gets to the $50 kind of mark, that creates an incentive for forestry.
For more forestry.
For more forestry. And what that creates is more forestry generated units. Because remember, a unit isn't... A unit, an NZU, is a license to pollute a ton of pollution. It's a pollution permit. That's what it is. So if I plant enough trees to soak up a ton of carbon from the atmosphere, I then get given a license to pollute a ton, which I can then sell to a polluting company. If there's, this incentive for people to, just keep planting more and more forests at $50 a ton, but the replacement cost of my coal-fired, milk drying unit is $80 a ton, then it makes more sense for me to plant trees and buy forestry offsets at $50 a ton. But it also means that there's actually more forestry generated pollution permits around than there are businesses to use them.
So you start to collapse the price.
So you start to collapse the price, which is what we've seen happen, right? Is that people are kind of getting the message that we've got this massive oversupply we've got a huge stockpile, something like 160, 170 million tonnes worth of units just sort of sitting in people's bank accounts. That's like 10 years worth of permits, that are needed. And then you've got people planting more and adding to that stockpile. And then what that means is that, quite unsurprisingly, people are kind of a little reticent to go out and pay top dollar to buy even more units.
So you've both got price collapse and sort of reduced social license to keep planting. So doesn't that argue in the end that there needs to be some sort of regulatory response to all of that?
Well, I thought so, which is why I started the review last year, but it got killed off in December. So
review of
the ETS, including those forestry settings.
Is the ETS not under review now? I thought it was.
No, that was killed off in December.
Right. Okay. Well, I was going to come to the ETS later, but let's talk about the ETS now.
Yeah.
Because what strikes me is that, so this has been a very big week for climate change announcements. There's both been the Climate Change Commission's advice, but there's also been, prior to that, the government's announcement that it would undertake a new independent review of the methane emissions from the agricultural sector, which is the most difficult, politically difficult issue that we face in our climate change response, it seems to me. The response of the market to that has been to drop the carbon price.
Yeah.
So,
well, the market.
How is the government going to? How is it credible?
Yeah.
I know it's kind of foolish for me to ask the
leader
of the Green Party what he thinks.
Yeah.
True. But if they want the ETS to carry the load, which they've said they do, then how's it going?
Well, my assessment is that the government wants a number of things in relation to climate change policy which are internally contradictory, and that's kind of part of what the market is responding to. So the market, my sense, I mean, it's a market, so it's not a sentient entity, but it's composed of a number of sentient entities who are kind of making, I think, a reasonably astute assessment, which is when there is a belief in the market that the settings will tighten and around climate and so on and so forth, and the number of units available will shrink, then the price goes up. I mean, that's just basic supply and demand, but it's people judging that today and saying, well, I think that the future is likely to get tighter and therefore I'll buy now while it's still reasonable to when the market believes that policy settings are going to be much more permissive and that supply of units will be plentiful, then the price goes down. And so two things have happened, one of which is that in killing off the Forestry review, that led to an assumption that the number of units generated by forestry was going to continue to be unlimited, right? And therefore, so that's, they're saying, okay, if we know that the market's oversupplied already, and the government's just signalled that they're quite happy for that to continue, then obviously that's one signal. The other thing is that doing things like killing off although this isn't inside the, it's a part of ETS policy, but it's adjacent to ETS policy, things like the clean car discount, opening up for more oil and gas exploration, kind of all of the signals that we're getting from the government are that actually they're not really all that concerned about fossil fuels and climate change and so on and so forth. That suggests that there isn't going to be a tightening of settings, even though Christopher Luxon keeps saying over and over and over and over and over again, we are committed to hitting the targets. When people look at the actual policy settings that have been announced over the last 6 months, that looks like like we're not so interested, and so the price goes down. That's just, in my view, a perfectly rational response to the signals that they're getting.
So let's just sort of helicopter up, to use a slightly Luxonian phrase.
Yeah.
Imagine that we're 10 years down the track, that's all happened. What's that going to have done to investment classes that are exposed to carbon prices, energy and climate change?
So if you assume that things don't change, if you think the current settings carry out...
If the market is right, and that in the end, this New Zealand government and perhaps future ones will take the view that ultimately people vote for them when the economy is growing, not because they just did something good. Then you would have a pessimistic view, and it seems very difficult to imagine that the ETS will have the impact intended.
Oh no, it
if that's
won't.
The case, what are the? I'm almost trying to get a sense from you as how you would think about that from an economic impact perspective.
I mean, it's deeply ironic, all this stuff around forestry, for example, because the almost inevitable thing is that if you don't get those settings right, then actually forestry will collapse, right? Because people will just stop buying more units. And so people have planted on the assumption of those forests granting more, not being valuable, but also every year storing more carbon and therefore generating more units.
Right.
But if no one's buying the units, then all of the assumptions that they made about investing in forestry in the first place collapse, right? So
what they do start doing at that point, ripping it back out again.
yeah, it's kind of, well, what's a better use of that land? You know, what gets me a greater economic return? Put it back into dairying, or you know, whatever's around at the time. So yeah, you can see some of those things. I think also, you know, like a weak ETS means that the transition, from fossil fuels to electricity becomes a lot slower, and so that means, for example, the dependency on imported petroleum products continues. So some of those kind of macro benefits don't accrue, but they do accrue to other countries. You have less innovation in the economy because frankly the need to get to net zero is driving a huge amount of innovation. People developing all sorts of amazing, you know, technological solutions to different parts of the jigsaw puzzle. And actually, if the signal from government is, well, actually we're pretty comfortable with the status quo, you know, we're going to, you know, have more gas supply, so we don't need to figure out how to convert away from gas, means, well, nobody bothers thinking of solutions to convert away from gas because there's no demand for it.
If we talk about methane, simply because it's a complex area, it seems to me that the whole thing turns on two opposing phrases. There, if you're a climate skeptical agricultural lobbyist, you'll talk about the desire to control methane at a no additional warming level.
Yes.
And the government appears in the independent review to be saying no additional warming is now the standard.
Yes.
If you're the Climate Change Commission, you don't want to have to look again at methane settings because there is no new science.
Yes.
So there's a no additional warming and a no new science.
Yes.
What's that about?
Well, I mean, the science of methane is well understood, right? So what the Commission is saying, and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and all of the actual scientists are saying, is that there is no new science on methane that will tell you anything differently for what we already know, which is like we actually understand what the warming effect is, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
There is an argument, though, is there not, about how you then interpret that to create an appropriate climate change policy response?
That's not science.
No.
That's policy, right? And politics. And that's what the no new warming is, right? That's not science. That's a political response to the science. So no new warming, it's actually, the phrase is slightly misconstrued, right? Because what it says is, when you say no new warming, what it sounds like to kind of the average punter is, if we emit exactly the same amount of methane as we are currently emitting, then there will be no further contribution to global warming, right? In other words, it stops. It's actually incorrect. I'm going to slightly over-egg this to make the point. What the phrase no new warming means is we're going to continue to cook the planet at the current rate and no more. So the question really is, do you think that cooking the planet at the current rate is working out or not? Right?
Yes.
That's the debate. Now,
the implication being that if you're not going, if cooking the planet at the current rate is not working out, and we need to not cook it as much,
drop
stop
methane.
cooking it.
That's right. Then you reduce
drop your
methane.
emissions.
I mean, the thing about methane is if you're kind of, you know, the Commission say, then you've got kind of four levers in front of you, just in terms of pure gas types, right? You've got the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the amount of nitrous oxide we put into the atmosphere, the amount of methane we put into the atmosphere, and the amount of carbon dioxide we take out of the atmosphere. Those are the four levers that you can pull. Now, in the Paris Agreement and in our legislation, we say that we're aiming to do our part towards maintaining a 1.5 degree threshold. Now, 10 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, we thought then that we had that if the world got to net zero, i.e. pulling all of those levers out in such a way across all four of those levers, then we would be able to stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees. Now we think that we've probably passed 1.5, maybe last year or this year. So we're kind of 25 years early on that side of things, which says that your time scale, we're out of time, right? But even
if everyone has to do more,
everyone has to do more.
Of that, if you're
everyone
going to be
had to do more, even to get to 2050. Frankly, but if you're up against time, then the problem with two of your levers is that they have, multi-century timescales. So carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. If you stopped putting those two gases into the atmosphere today, all of it, 100%, every car, every industrial operation that works, if they closed down today, the 2,000 gigatons of CO2 that we've pumped into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution would continue to cook the atmosphere, right? And in an accumulative sense, right? So that just gets worse, which is why you need the fourth lever. You actually need to suck it back out of the atmosphere in enormous amounts. Methane's different, right? Because methane has an incredibly powerful short-term effect. Like it's something like 189 times more powerful in terms of the warming effect, when that molecule is in the atmosphere. So if you increase the flow of methane into the atmosphere, it has many multiple times the warming impact of carbon dioxide. But the corollary is, if you start to reduce it, right, then you actually essentially have a cooling effect because it degrades in decades rather than in centuries.
Yeah, so it's a short-lived
gas, right? When people talk about no new warming, what they're arguing for is essentially the right to continue to warm at the current rate. And what they say is that you should compare that to the industrial sectors who are still allowed to continue. In fact, because the CO2 that a coal-fired power plant puts into the atmosphere, even when that's shut, the impact of that will continue. Whereas if you shut a farm down, then actually the atmosphere gets cooler as a result.
Yeah.
So they're arguing a fairness, kind of burden sharing argument. That's not science. So the independent expert panel that the government has commissioned to provide additional advice to the independent expert panel, that is the Climate Change Commission, is supposed to come up with a different answer to the answer that the Climate Change Commission are giving them. Because they already know what the Climate Change Commission says and they don't like the answer. So therefore, they want a different answer, so therefore they get a different independent expert panel. They're going to keep asking the question until they get the answer they want.
It seems to me that somewhere in the middle of all of this, there is actually an argument about what is an appropriate level of reduction of methane emissions over the period from now to 2050 that is actually realistically achievable.
Yes.
And the part of the problem is that, indulge me with this theory, part of the trouble is that the range at the moment proposed is so large that they're saying farmers are saying that between now and 2050 they've got to go somewhere between 24% and 47%, and they're all freaking out about 47%.
Yes.
Now some of them would like to do 10.
Yes.
But many of them, I think, would probably live with 24.
Yeah,
isn't that where we're heading?
Yeah, no, you've got a. So you're absolutely right, and that range, it always frustrated me. We pulled that range from the UNFCCC report, which basically said, if you did that, here's what needs to happen to methane. It needs to go down by about 11% by 2030, and it needs to go down between 24 and 47. So we literally just imported the range from the UNFCCC kind of global ranges, but that was only ever supposed to be interim. Now, if you take the no new warming approach, then you would say methane should decline possibly at 0.3%, sort of on an annual basis, right?
So it seems to me that until New Zealand's grass-fed pastoral farming systems have access to some kind of technology which competes with the grain-fed methane inhibitors that our agricultural competitors use, farmers do have a reasonable argument that there's damn all they can do about it apart from destock.
Yeah, assuming that we continue to make the same kind of food in the future that we're making today, which of course, if you look back on the history of New Zealand agriculture, it has never stood still, right? There are twice as many cows today than there were in 1990, and there are a third as many sheep, right? Yep. So the balance has changed dramatically just in the last kind of 2 to 3 decades. And that could well change again in the future. Yeah. The other thing is that this is not universally true, right? But there are many farm systems around the country where the over-intensification has added zero additional profit, right? Because the input cost to get the marginal additional cow is as high as the revenue from the marginal additional cow. Yep. So there are a number of places where farmers have reduced their stocking rate by anywhere from 10 to 15%, which means that their water and supplementary feed and fertilizer costs have gone down by more than the production margin, which means they're actually more profitable with fewer cows. But because the system is driven by production levels, by volume, rather than by profit, that's not a widely adopted kind of approach. And part of the reason for that is because the processes require volume, right? And so they make their money on volume, and then they pass that profit through in the form of dividends to the farmers. So there's very little incentive. In fact, there's precisely zero incentive for the processors to worry about stocking rates, and there's a kind of there's less incentive for the farmer, because if the farm's not making any additional money or profit, they kind of get it through the volume sale from the processor.
There is some incentive on the processor though, isn't there? I mean, yesterday, for example, when the AgriZero Alliance added another 3 shareholders.
Yes.
That's got A2.
2 of which are banks.
two are banks.
Yes.
You tell me why you think that is. But 2 of them are also, at least 2 of them are listed companies.
Yes.
A2 and Synlait. And the banks, of course, are listed as well. So they
the
are seeing a reason to do that.
Is that their customers are telling them that they need to reduce their emissions, right? So they're kind of caught up in somebody else's kind of scope 3 supply chain. And one of the things I found kind of fascinating about that AgriZero presentation is when they put the ambition up, it's a 30% reduction in methane by 2030. 30% in 5 years. That's their ambition that they're shooting for. That is 3 times the legislative target and 10 times the target that Fed Farmers, Groundswell and their proxies in Parliament want to have. And so you're kind of getting this divergence now.
Do you regard that 30% cut as credible, based on, presumably they're basing that on the fact that these 6 companies and you and I, through money collected through the ETS, as I understand it, funding 185 million odd of research over 4 years?
Well, it's not research. Well, there is some research, but it's mostly commercialisation. You've got to remember, we spent $200 million over a 15-year period on primary research, but none of it got commercialised. So the reason why we set up AgriZero was to go, actually, we need to start rolling this out on farms. So what do you got? So AgriZero is not a research centre, right? We've got research centres. Its job is to take that research and work out how to get it on farm. And that to me is the exciting thing. And the fact that you've got Fonterra and Silver Fern and ANSCO and A1 or A2 and so on involved. You ask me if I think it's credible. I'm not the guy to ask, right? They are. They seem to think that that's credible.
International aviation and shipping, we're seeing draft advice on that for the first time.
Yeah.
Haven't really tangled with it. What are the implications for New Zealand businesses and listed companies potentially? Are there any?
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there must be. But does it matter what we do here, or is it happening to them anyway?
Bringing aviation and shipping in to our kind of domestic target settings and policy settings and so on and so forth isn't going to require other sectors to have to work harder to squeeze down in order to fit them in, right? Because that's already been kind of baked in. from a sort of economic sense, like there's kind of colossal opportunity. I mean, Air New Zealand issued an expression of interest a couple of weeks ago for tens of millions of litres per week of sustainable aviation fuel, and I know that there'll be businesses up and down the place that are responding to that, and that can flow through into other areas. Like one of the assumptions is that we'll be using forestry / and kind of waste wood from our plants to be the feedstock for that. So you can see a whole ecosystem of industry building up to be able to supply that. There'll probably be a impact on fuel costs, because that'll be higher than aviation. Than fossil
sustainable
fuels.
aviation fuel at the moment is at least 3 times more expensive.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that's a scale thing. It'll probably come down to a mere twice as expensive.
Yes, that's a reasonable presumption before.
Yeah. But still more expensive, and so then that thing gets reflected in ticket prices, and then on top of that, you're probably going to need. I mean, that's why mandates are so important, right? Because one airline saying that they're going to spend twice as much on fuel as another competing airline, that's not going to work.
No,
right?
they're not going to do it.
No. The other thing, of course, is that people are going to want to get beyond sustainable aviation fuel to alternative energy, as fast as they can, and so that's going to drive yet more innovation and so on as well.
What's your sense, talking now about climate change reporting and the requirement on NZX listed companies to do that reporting? What's your sense of how well prepared New Zealand firms are, and how difficult it is going to be for some of them, at least, to comply effectively? Well,
the ones that have actual mandatory compliance is only about 200 businesses. But the reporting requirements are being pushed up their supply chains. So, I think that's coming as a bit of a surprise to those that aren't mandated. But we always knew with something like this that it was going to, there'd be a sort of an initial period, probably of several years, where the standard has to get written, it has to get understood, people have to put in place, their kind of reporting systems. There's going to be, a few years where people are looking at each other's reports going, why do you do it differently from the way I, it's just going to be messy for a while.
So, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because on the one hand, I think you would say that if we responded well to climate change, there'd be an enormous amount of economic opportunity in that, and that, all things being equal, you'd probably actually come out ahead. When you look at where we're at in our climate change journey right now, what do you think the actual implications and impacts for our economy look like for the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, it's pretty risky, and that's why the reporting requirements are so important, right? Because what that does is it shows shareholders and investors and analysts and directors and management the scale of the risk that they're currently exposed to, but they didn't know about 2 years ago because it wasn't being looked at. And if you take, a bank, for example, with a large mortgage book, what percentage of those mortgages are at risk from sea level rise or because you've got houses on floodplains? Well, you can take a look at the city of Auckland after the anniversary day floods and start to get a picture of that. And then you add the insurance markets on top of that, that then becomes a significant material risk to the bank. You take that mortgage book for residential homes and then you look at the exposure to the agricultural sector, right? And I know that I know that there are banks out there where you've got rural banking managers talking to their farmers about how to A, reduce their emissions, and B, increase their resilience to, kind of floods, fires, droughts and storms.
That conversation has started yet amongst real estate owners, residential real estate?
Yeah, in some places. I mean, you only need to go on the property apps to see that people are still buying houses by the sea. But it's definitely picking up. And frankly, the insurance industry, I know that they cop a lot of flack, but they are doing us a favour here because they have been sounding the alarm year after year, increasingly loud, saying, hey, look, your premiums are going to go up if you don't fix this, and then we don't fix it, and then your premiums go up, and everyone goes, oh, wait, what, huh? Or in some places they're saying we're going to get out of, I'm sorry, that property's uninsurable.
Maybe that's the one thing we can be absolutely certain about is that insurance will become more expensive.
Yes, so here's my proxy. So the rate of increase in climate-related claims exceeded the rate of GDP growth in 2007 in New Zealand and has been growing ever since. So the wedge of our economy, right? So whilst the economy's been growing, insurance costs from disasters, natural hazards, has been growing at a faster rate than the overall economy, which means every year we're spending more and more and more and more on disaster recovery.
So, James, it all sounds a bit bleak. Is there anything we should be enthusiastic about, positive about, optimistic about?
Yeah, heaps.
What?
And this is the thing that it does, because this is kind of the hardest part of my job as climate change minister, is you have to tell the truth about the situation that we're in, and it is bleak. It is bleak, right? It's bad news, and that news gets worse. But the great advantage but you also have to give people hope, right? And the great advantage of my job was that I got to see all the cool stuff that was happening as well as all the bad stuff. And so this transition to me is the greatest investment opportunity of a lifetime, or possibly several lifetimes. Because when you look at basically every category, right, of infrastructure, housing, transport, energy, waste management, foods and agriculture, like you name it, somebody's got to invent something, commercialize it and sell it, that's a solution to some part of the problem. And you can, the amount of money that's going into what's loosely called green finance, climate capital and so on is astonishing. The numbers are absolutely eye-popping, especially if you're from kind of little old New Zealand where we run out of zeros at a certain number. And there's kind of loads of startups and so on. Those two things aren't quite geared together yet, right? And so I think there's a challenge there, which is we've got to make sure that an allocation of capital actually results in those businesses and startups actually getting access to the capital that they need. But I think there are people who are kind of playing in that space too. So at COP 28 last year in Dubai, obviously I was no longer the minister at that point, so I didn't have to spend 16 hours a day stuck in a room arguing with petrostates about the end of the world. I got to wander around the rest of the site looking at and meeting with all of the businesses who are doing kind of cool things, and it's mind-blowing. My only fear is that we're still arguing about, whether or not we should do something, yes. And we could miss out on that. At the very least, we should be surfing that wave. But I firmly believe that we should be the wave, right? Not just the little bit on top.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much for your time today, James. Thanks for coming in. Better let you get away to question time. There's bound to be something in there to warm the cockles of your heart, perhaps. How many more have you got to go?
Very few, actually, because I'm leaving on May the 1st, which is a Wednesday. So, in fact, this is my third to last question time.
Well, I hope you enjoy the sense that it's all about to end.
Yeah, I'm enjoying that sense a great deal.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks everyone for tuning in. You can watch Shared Lunch on YouTube or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a rating and a comment about what topics you'd like to hear about in the future, and we have a special offer for you for Sharesies investors from BusinessDesk. If you use the promo code Shared Lunch 2024, all one word, you'll get $100 off an annual subscription to BusinessDesk. The offer only applies to new BusinessDesk subscribers, can only be used once per subscriber, and can't be used with any other discounts or offers. Enjoy the rest of your week.